There you are. All better.
You patched me up.
Look at reviews for Capcom's latest Pragmata and one comparison keeps coming up. It feels like an Xbox 360 game. VGC called it a remaster of an early 7th gen title that never existed. Eurogamer pointed at Watch Dogs, Vanquish, Lost Planet, Gears of War and Dead Rising as obvious touchstones, writing that Pragmata manages to feel so derivative and so original at the same time. And they're not baseless comparisons. Pragmata riffs on the third-person shooting that defined the era while borrowing from the visual language of Vanquish and the mechanical moxie of Dead Space. Its combat blends over-the-shoulder shooting with real-time logic puzzles as robot Tot Diana hacks enemies to make them vulnerable, while shooty spaceman Hugh tries to stay alive long enough to actually down them. Separately, both systems are simple, but together they're wonderfully frantic, the kind of idea that could easily have been insufferable but somehow becomes the thing you fall for, much like the tiny android at the heart of its story. One reviewer aptly called it Dad Space. Hugh and Diana belong to a familiar lineage, the hardened, emotionally inarticulate protector, paired with a gifted young companion who gives shape to the story's softer and more vulnerable centre. There's one very obvious game it's riffing on, and I am of course talking about Donkey Kong Bonanza. But I guess I'm also talking about The Last of Us, Bioshock Infinite, and Telltale's The Walking Dead. So while Capcom have once again found themselves defining the new hotness, much of Pragmata's praise has been framed around nostalgia for a 20-year-old era of games. In 2026, saying something feels like an Xbox 360 game isn't a criticism but a compliment.
Do you have an appointment?
The name's Bond.
James Bond. He's with me.
Capcom's latest isn't the only game to be crowned heir apparent this year. There's 007 First Light from IO Interactive, the Danish studio best known for the Hitman games, and Tomb Raider Legacy of Atlantis from Crystal Dynamics and Flying Wild Hog. And then there are a handful of less celebrated cases that draw the fine line between evoking the era and being trapped by it. Samsung and Mind's Eye. What all five share is simple enough. They're linear, single-player, more or less complete experiences. They also feel like callbacks to something we don't really get at the top end anymore. The single A banger, the mid-budget action game that isn't trying to be the biggest thing ever made, they're just trying to deliver the goods. Lara Croft has always been royalty in that space. Tomb Raider 2013 is one of those games seemingly everyone has played, most have enjoyed, and almost nobody talks about as a sacred system-selling masterpiece. It's just a really solid adventure game, and honestly that's been Lara's lane since the PlayStation era. Stylish, accessible, and dependable action-adventure craft. IO and James Bond sit comfortably in that same middle ground. Bond games have a long history of solid outings thanks to EA's post-GoldenEye third-person adventures, as has IO's own Hitman series, which has spent decades giving stealth action players intricate spaces to poke, prod, and ruin in increasingly elaborate ways. In that sense, First Light almost feels like IO circling back to Hitman Absolution, a more action-heavy, globe-trotting adventure very much shaped by the 360 era's love for Uncharted, one that always felt a little strange for Agent 47's cold and calculated murder admin, but might be a perfect fit for a younger James Bond. Screen Hub preview noted as car chases felt very Xbox 360 in its arcadey and drift-heavy mechanics. Push Square went even further, calling the airport shootout sequence the kind of thing we'd expect if Uncharted had received a native PS5 entry by now. But then there's Samson from Liquid Swords, the studio founded by the co-creator of Just Cause, a third-person action-adventure brawler for your PC you can grab for just $25. Ironically, you play as a debt-ridden bruiser boxing his way through the nastiest city on earth. PC Gamer called it a throwback in the best way possible, while the most upvoted Steam reviews described it as a no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point PS3-style driver and beat-em-up. Unfortunately, Samson launched in a rough state, repetitive combat, technical issues, a story that doesn't quite hold together, and the mixed reviews reflect that. A game that clearly understands what it wants to be, but couldn't quite get there on the budget and timeline it had. Mind's Eye is the more cautionary tale, directed by Leslie Benzies, formerly of Rockstar, which the marketing was not shy about. It arrived in June 2025 to genuinely catastrophic reviews. Games Radar called it an unabashedly stripped-back, no-nonsense 360-era throwback 10-hour single-player campaign, but not in the way that ultimately worked in its favour. The Jimquisition was more damning, writing that it was a flimsy imitation of Watch Dogs filtered through the brown-scale lens of a mediocre 7th-generation game, the kind of uncharismatic fluff that padded out the Xbox 360's library. Both games are worth including in this conversation because the response, even from the people who didn't enjoy them, was rarely boredom. Players could see what these games were reaching for even if the execution just wasn't there. The appetite for this kind of genre fare is still very much wanted. But to get at why these games are landing the way they are, it's worth asking what we actually mean when we say something feels like a 360 game, because it's probably not what you think. When people usually talk about the Xbox 360 era, or the PS3 era for the loyal Sony soldiers in the audience,
I'm talking about that PS triple.
they usually start with the visuals. It was the big leap into high definition, and the moment engines like Unreal 3 with pioneering normal map and global illumination techniques dominated AAA production. Culturally though, its visuals are less fondly remembered for two things: brown and bloom. Think Gears of War, Call of Duty, and the dozens of games riffing on the success. It was the era's photorealism, shaped as much by popular war on terror cinema as by technical imitation. We got 1,000 bald space marines because convincing hair was still a fair ways off. Pragmata doesn't really resemble any of that. Built on Capcom's cutting-edge RE engine, with ray-traced lighting and photo-driven shaders, it largely sidesteps the uncanny sheen of the 7th generation. Even luscious looks aren't really an issue now, so what exactly makes it feel like a game at a time? When the 360 era gets a vote now, through the rearview mirror of nostalgia, it's for a kind of experimental confidence in game design. To borrow from that Eurogamer comparison, titles like Dead Rising, Lost Planet and Vanquish were all building on the impact of Capcom's big GameCube success Resident Evil 4, be it a time-bound open-world action game with hundreds of zombies on screen, or large-scale monster vs mecha spectacle, or cover shooting supercharged with character action flair. And that's before you get to Uncharted, Mass Effect, or odd little experiments like Dark Void, all of which kept stretching what the third-person action game could actually be. And that fever was felt across all genres. You had Fallout and immersive sims reinvented as first-person shooters, open worlds rapidly evolving through Far Cry and Assassin's Creed, indies properly broke through with Braid, Bastion and Super Meat Boy. We even got the best Batman games ever made. Maybe it was the technology finally catching up with developer ambition, or games maturing as a culture, or perhaps it was just the industry briefly finding a sweet spot before everything got quite so expensive and terrifying. But looking back, the generation had this sense of forward momentum, as if every other month the big publishers were finding some new shape for games to take. At least that's what it felt like when I was 15. The irony is that this wasn't unique to the 7th generation, and with the hindsight of today, it's funny that so many are nostalgic for the PS360 era, because this was the moment where games nostalgia really began. People were already rediscovering PS2 and the original Xbox through backwards compatibility, while PS1 and N64 classics found second lives on handhelds like the PSP and DS. Then Xbox Live Arcade and WiiWare pushed that further, making the simplicity and the immediacy of the NES and Mega Drive eras newly fashionable. That appetite fueled a wave of deliberate throwbacks: Mega Man 9 and 10, Sonic the Hedgehog 4, the Bit Trip series, and eventually kickstarted success stories like Shovel Knight. The early blogosphere, Kotaku, Destructoid and Game Trailers helped supercharge that reverence for the past, partly as a reaction to the grey gun games dominating AAA at the time, just before independent developers gave players a proper way out. That's always been the appeal of nostalgia. It filters out the worst of an era and buffs the good bits until they shine. Every generation has its duds, and those underappreciated masterpieces that only seem to make sense later. We think fondly of Vanquish now, but it didn't fully break through at the time, partly because the market was absolutely flooded with third-person shooters and action games. 20 years later, it stands out more clearly. Not because the games changed, obviously, but because the industry around it did. It's why, as rough as they are, we can't help but like Samsung and Mind's Eye for trying to do something different. Pragmata seems to be getting that same future classic treatment, only with the future arriving slightly ahead of schedule, seeing it's already sold 2 million copies in less than 2 weeks. The thing is, players aren't really nostalgic for the 7th generation of consoles because in some ways it never properly ended. Obviously, the PS4 and PS5 did happen, but the ideas that defined the PS3 era didn't disappear in the same clean way that mascot platformers faded after the PlayStation or traditional JRPGs lost dominance to the Xbox era. The third-person action-adventure template, over-the-shoulder combat, linear storytelling, charismatic protagonist carried on. Horizon Zero Dawn, the God of War reboot, Marvel Spider-Man, the newer Last of Us game, these are all direct descendants. The difference is that while games like this were everywhere in the 360 era, in 2026 they feel more like exceptions. What changed things wasn't a shift in tastes, it was a dawn of the live service era, and the move from games as singular works to ongoing platforms. Fortnite, Roblox, GTA Online, these aren't games you simply buy, finish and move on from. They're places to keep returning to, sustained by seasonal content and updates. Prestige single-player games like Red Dead Redemption 2 might win awards and dominate the conversation, but they don't keep generating revenue in quite the same way beyond that initial purchase. And in an industry increasingly shaped by investor logic, that matters more than anyone would like to admit.
Heck of a thing, ain't it? Sure shit beats the hell out of dying.
Not every developer followed that path though, and the one that resisted it most stubbornly and the most successfully is, of all companies, Capcom. There was a wobble towards the end of the PS3 era into the PS4, the outsourced experiments like Dead Rising 3 and Operation Raccoon City, and odd duck releases like Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, but from Resident Evil 7 onwards, Capcom found its rhythm again. RE2 Remake, Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter Rise. The remake of Resident Evil 4, after just 2 years, hit 10 million copies sold faster than any other game in the series. These aren't cult games that found their audience eventually. They sold immediately to enormous numbers of people, and they did it by being polished, focused, and authored experiences with a clear idea behind them. In an era supposedly hostile to that kind of game, Capcom just kept making them. Pragmata isn't reinventing the wheel, but it feels fresher than Capcom's usual IP fare because AAA, broadly speaking, has been trying to avoid games like this in search of games as a service success. But how about the elephant in the room? The N-word. Oh god, no, not that one. I'm Nintendo. The PS360 era saw Nintendo take a very different path for the games industry. Rather than competing on graphical fidelity or AAA spectacle, they shifted focus towards new audiences and new forms of play, driven by the enormous success of the Wii. Ever since, Nintendo has often seemed one generation behind in raw hardware terms, which has had a strange side effect. Developers have had to think across a much broader range of technical possibilities. Something like Breath of the Wild might well have been possible in the 360, and Donkey Kong Bonanza might have been possible on the PS4, but Nintendo has never really followed the trends of those systems. If anything, it's created plenty of its own. The Switch in particular supercharged the indie scene, turning the handheld into a genuine home for the kind of small to mid-sized games that had been squeezed out of AAA, and the appetite it demonstrated helped pave the way for crossover devices like the Steam Deck, which has only deepened that ecosystem further. Which brings up one last argument. The one thing that stops us from calling the 360 era truly back is that its influence hasn't trickled beyond the AAA. The process by which an era's aesthetic becomes a texture, something malleable and self-aware, tends to happen outside the mainstream first. Consider the pattern. The NES boom of the 7th generation galvanized first-time developers who grew up on those games. As entry-level tools made it possible for tiny studios to ship something legitimate, they reached for what they knew. Chunky sprites, platforming action, beeps and boops. Then that nostalgic window shifted. We got PS1 horrors, warped low-poly dread as its own distinct visual language. We got SNES era RPGs and N64 style character platformers. More recently, Detective Instinct Farewell My Beloved has arrived as a near pitch-perfect throwback to the DS visual novel, with Ace Attorney and Hotel Dusk as obvious reference points. Each of these eras has something that can be distilled, a graphical or sonic limitation that with enough distance stops looking like a constraint and starts looking like a style. The Xbox 360 and PS3 don't quite have that yet. The brown and bloom, the aggressive lens flares, the slightly too shiny surfaces, these are all too recent and readers' embarrassing mistakes rather than deliberate choices. This nostalgic reappraisal has only just began to happen for the PS2 era, and even then only in specific cases. The best example is the Big Catch with its pitch-perfect recreation of the visual noise of Jak and Daxter. But give it time, someone will make a game that treats exaggerated normal maps and bald space marines not as relics to be ashamed of, but a palette to paint with. Until then, we're in the interesting middle ground, old enough to miss it, but too recent to properly mythologize it. So are we in peak PS360 nostalgia? Not yet. What we're in is the awkward but exciting early phase of it. The games are starting to arrive and the critical language is forming. Pragmata, First Light, Legends of Atlantis, Samson and Mind's Eye, these aren't a movement yet, but they might just be the leading edge of one. And what's interesting is that the nostalgia isn't really for the consoles, or their achievement systems, or the voice chat, or even the games themselves. It's for a design philosophy that the live service era didn't so much kill as quietly crowd out. The idea that a game can have a beginning, a middle, and an end, they can try one interesting thing and commit to it, that it can ship somewhat complete, get reviewed, and then just be done. No roadmaps, no battle passes, no season 2. PS360 era wasn't perfect. It was flooded with derivative brown shooters, full of corporate misfires and forgotten experiments, and it laid the groundwork for a lot of the industry's worst tendencies as much as its best, but it also had that forward momentum in AAA that feels sorely lacking today. That's what Pragmata feels like, and that's what I think so many are nostalgic for. And maybe, if slowly, that's what's coming back. But I want to hear from you. What are the new games that give you that feeling, be it from the AAA publishers or the tiny independents? Drop them in the comments. As always, this video has been made possible by my lovely Patreon supporters. I'm James, and I'll see you all in the next upload.